Welcome to session 9 of the Simple course. In the first part of today's session, we'll review advanced distress tolerance skills. Looking ahead, in session 11, we'll finish the distress tolerance module by reviewing physiological distress tolerance skills. In session 13, we'll then start the second DBT module, mindfulness. In the second part of the session, we'll present two case studies, Anne and Bruce, to practice finding targets for the Hole's diary cards. To watch our introductory video entitled How Does Social Change Happen? Please pause this video now and open session 9 on the website itsimple2021.com. Next are our usual reminders directed mostly at people doing the course in a group. Please take a few moments to read these on your own. To watch this week's mindfulness practice video, please go to the website now. For people doing the YouTube course as part of a group, you can now pause for questions, comments, or feedback. Let's review what we will do today. We will start by reviewing the skills training workbook, pages 47 to 68. This is our fourth week discussing distress tolerance. We will continue looking at advanced distress tolerance skills. We will then turn to Simple Manual Session 9, which gives us two case studies of how to do the Hole's diary card. If you'd like to volunteer to practice the tools and skills during a session, you can email us or let us know during the session. We will then take a break at the midway point and have our usual time for questions, comments, and feedback. Please rate your homework now. Today, we review pages 47 to 68 of the Skills Training Workbook, Advanced Distress Tolerance Skills, which covers 7 topics: live in the moment, coping thoughts, radical acceptance, self-affirmation, cope, new coping strategies, and coping plans. To watch a video about radical acceptance skills, please go to the website now. As part of the homework for the last week, we asked you to read pages 47 to 68 of the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Skills Workbook, 2nd edition. In our review, we will cover the key points from this section of the workbook. This summary is not meant to replace you having read these pages in the workbook and try the exercises. Today, we'll discuss the following skills. 1. Live in the present moment. 2. Use self-encouraging coping thoughts. 3. Radical acceptance. 4. Self-affirming statements. 5. The feelings threat balance. 6. Creating new coping strategies. And 7. Create an emergency coping plan. Many young children raised in reasonable circumstances are naturally able to live in the present moment. That is why many of these children later report that their childhood experiences were so vivid and intense and long to feel that poignancy again. They experience what psychologists call lantern consciousness, which is a type of consciousness that casts a light on everything in their environment. This type of consciousness is associated with the right hemisphere of the brain. Most adults outgrow that way of experiencing the world. They don't live in the present. They spend much of their time thinking ahead to the future or going back to the past. As a result, they miss a lot of what is going on in the present. Their consciousness becomes very focused on their thoughts instead of their environment. This is known as spotlight consciousness, which is associated with the left brain. Mindfulness practices help you learn to direct your consciousness and pay attention to that which you wish to pay attention to. It's a way of being able to experience both lantern and spotlight consciousnesses. We previously discussed how grounding exercises tend to take us from our focus on the past or the future and direct that attention to the present sensations and perceptions. Living in the present can be quite difficult for adults, as we are so used to time traveling. Time travel can be pleasant, but can also be very unpleasant when it is dominated by anxious or depressive thoughts and imagery. Learning to live in the present can be fostered through meditation practices. Learning to live in the present is an advanced distress tolerance skill. Grounding techniques are a type of mindfulness meant to bring us back to the present from our time travels to the past and the future. If you spend a lot of time in distressing time traveling, consider practicing grounding techniques. Noticing your breath or the sensations in your body without judging them or wanting them to change are grounding techniques that everyone can easily learn to do. To make them a habit and become good at them requires practice. You may be familiar with the children's story of the little engine that could. When faced with an enormous obstacle, rather than giving up or being daunted by the magnitude of the challenge, the little engine repeated to himself the mantra, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. Once he climbed the mountain, he joyously changed that mantra to, I thought I could, I thought I could, I thought I could, I thought I could. I had a patient who, when faced with challenges, had a mantra, I can't, I can't, I can't. One day, I brought to one of our sessions the book, and we read it together. She was never again able to say, I can't, without smiling. She began to consider that she could, and slowly she learned to climb her own mountains. Find your own mantra to help you climb your mountains. The workbook offers some examples on pages 50 and 51. In Western culture, we think in an either or binary fashion. Things are either black or white, hot or cold. In our culture, opposites contradict each other and are incompatible. Eastern traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, think in a both and dialectical fashion. Rather than being compatible, opposites complement each other. This complementarity is depicted in the yin and yang symbol. The German philosopher W.F. Hegel borrowed the idea of the complementarity of opposite ideas from Eastern thought and named it thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Thesis is one idea, antithesis is its seemingly opposite idea. Synthesis is the combination of thesis and antithesis into a more nuanced and complex idea that incorporates both. DBT is dialectical. It reconciles opposites, such as radically accepting that you are as you are, while at the same time seeing the necessity for making changes. Self-encouraging or affirming statements give us the courage or heart, which is where the word courage comes from, to face an obstacle. To affirm means to state positively. To self-affirm means to see the positive in yourself. We all have a combination of traits that could be classified as positive or negative. Some people pay disproportionate attention to their negative traits. Self-affirming statements encourage us to find some positive traits in ourselves in order to balance what may be a negative opinion of ourselves. Page 58 of the workbook provides us with a list of self-affirming statements. Choose 2 or 3 that you think applies to yourself. As with previous skills, write them down and keep them in reserve. They will come in handy to use with your tools. At times, our feelings might tell us that something is enormously threatening. When we access our rational mind and evaluate that same threat, it may seem much less serious than what our emotional mind is telling us. A feelings threat balance encourages us to look at the threats we face from both the emotional and the rational perspectives. Sometimes a threat will be very serious when seen from emotional and rational mind. Those threats should be acted on. Sometimes a threat will seem very serious from emotional mind, but much less serious from rational mind. With those threats, we should consider taking a break, hitting the pause button, or just not doing it. We've said this before, but we'll repeat it again. The skills training workbook provides us with many skills and strategies to deal with our distress, but no one uses all these skills. We strongly encourage you to have a list of at most 6 to 8 distress tolerance skills from all the ones we've covered so far, and use those in your day to day life when you are using tools. Trying to use any more may set you up for failure. We will now turn to the stories of Bruce and Anne, which you can find on pages 108 to 111 of the Simple Manual. These case studies are meant to help us to find our intermediate diary card target holes. Bruce was a 66-year-old, 6'3", charming and friendly owner of an auto body shop. He humorously quipped that he was still floored that Sandra, his wife, had put up with his bullshit for more than 40 years. Over the last 25 years, Bruce had seen several psychiatrists and psychotherapists who had diagnosed him with chronic depression. His symptoms fluctuated in intensity from relatively mild to severe, with accompanying occasional suicidal ideation. Bruce had tried several different medications. Some helped for a short period of time, but then wore off. He had come to believe that medications were not the answer. He hated their side effects, feeling emotionally disconnected, gaining weight, and losing his libido. Bruce joined the Simple group and was learning to use Hole's diary cards. He joked that he had always been a problem student, and so he was happy to keep using the beginner targets, feeling bad forever. At one of the group sessions, Bruce volunteered to work on his Hole's diary cards to find intermediate targets. The numbers on Bruce's Hole's diary cards, beginner targets, feeling bad, usually hovered around 2 or 3. There was, however, a day, the previous week, when Bruce recorded a 9. That was followed by a few more days of higher than baseline numbers. To find intermediate targets, Bruce followed the algorithm. He considered what had happened around this period of emotional activation. Bruce and Sandra had attended the funeral of one of his elderly aunts. It had taken place in a town a 2-hour drive from their home. After the funeral, he and Sandra drove back home. Bruce was quietly absorbed in his own thoughts. Having contact with his family always had this effect on him. Suddenly, they were passed on the road by a large and loud pickup truck, which seemed to come out of nowhere and had, after recklessly overtaking them, swerved back into their lane, just a couple of feet ahead of their vehicle. Sandra, a corrections officer, did not endure misbehavior quietly, and reaching over to the steering wheel, blasted the horn for what seemed to Bruce like an eternity. For a moment, Bruce froze, and then briskly pushed Sandra's hand away and gave her one of his angriest looks. Not a word was spoken for the remainder of the drive. Sandra quietly, indignantly, stared out the window. The couple barely spoke to each other for the next 2 days. As he told the story, Bruce was becoming emotionally activated. He remembered his personal dashboard and worked on returning to the window of emotional tolerance that is needed to continue to do the work. Bruce and Sandra followed the same pattern every time they had a significant disagreement. For a few days following these blow-ups, Bruce's depression was always much worse. Consulting the Wheel of Feelings for help in naming his emotions, Bruce realized that he'd felt several emotions: a sadness, which related to feeling hurt, guilty, vulnerable, and lonely; anger, which was related to feeling humiliated, frustrated, and annoyed; fear, which was related to feeling scared, anxious, insecure, and rejected. These feelings were awfully familiar to him. He had felt them most of his life. Bruce next considered the thoughts that were associated with these feelings. Even prior to the pickup incident, Bruce had been feeling sad, thinking about his dysfunctional family of origin that he had seen at the funeral. When Sandra honked the horn, he thought she was inappropriate, rude, and confrontational, and was going to get them into trouble with an obviously deranged driver. He thought she did not understand him and only added to his pain. Incidents similar to this happened all the time and would just keep happening. He would never be happy. Sandra had probably honked the horn because she was upset with him for being so quiet. Using the list of internalizing and externalizing behaviors, Bruce realized he had become withdrawn, had limited his activity level, fixated on a series of negative thoughts, and looked depressed. These feelings, thoughts, and behaviors were some of the features of the hole Bruce had fallen into. Because similar fights happened between him and Sandra about once a month and took several days to recover from, Bruce was eager to find ways to understand and avoid them. Reviewing the hole's diary card algorithm, Bruce considered the options and decided that feeling hurt, withdrawing, and catastrophizing were the features of the hole that he wanted to track on his hole's diary card. During the honking incident, they had escalated to the level of a crisis, but on other occasions, Bruce felt them also, although not as intensely. Feeling hurt, withdrawing, and catastrophizing became Bruce's new intermediate targets. This is the algorithm for finding your intermediate targets. 1. Start with a beginner hole, or think of a time when you've been in a hole, lost it, struggled, felt bad, got into trouble, or were very upset. 2. When this happened, what were your feelings, thoughts, or behaviors? Use the wheel of feelings, thinking errors and ants, and the internalizing and externalizing behavior slides to help you. 3. Choose from 1 to 3 feelings, thoughts, or behaviors that you experience frequently and or are consequential for you. 4. Use this as your intermediate targets. Intermediate targets change over time, so go through the same process once in a while, especially if your circumstances are changing. Feeling hurt, withdrawing, and catastrophizing became Bruce's new intermediate targets. We met Anne in session 5 on page 69 of the Simple Manual. She was a nurse working at the family-run nursing home that had been sold to new owners. Anne was trying to adjust to a stressful and challenging situation without becoming overwhelmed by her lifelong symptoms of anxiety and depression. Anne was particularly anxious about her weekly meetings with her supervisor, Jane. She had prepared and, in her imagination, practiced a crisis plan to help her with these intense feelings and thoughts. Anne found that doing this helpful. She liked using the personal dashboard because it helped her to pay attention to her feelings before they became overwhelming. She was also becoming more aware of the importance of her energy balance indicator and the importance of staying in the window of emotional tolerance. When she noticed that she was becoming activated, she self-regulated by reminding herself of the coping thoughts she had chosen to use. She also thought of her values, being of service to the residents, the staff, and carrying on the legacy of Ezra and Ruth. Anne now wanted to try to find intermediate targets for her diary card. She recalled that they were the same as the holes used in Crisis Plan, feelings, thoughts, or behaviors occurring when she was struggling to cope. Using the wheel of feelings, Anne recognized that when she was emotionally activated, she often felt fear and sadness. Other emotions from the wheel that she related to were scared, anxious, worried, vulnerable, and fragile. Anne realized that her negative thoughts tend to fall into the categories of all or nothing, emotional reasoning, and catastrophizing. Her behaviors were all internalizing, withdrawal, fixating on certain thoughts, and avoiding social situations. Looking at this list, Anne thought she could use ruminating on negative thoughts and withdrawing as her intermediate targets. Being artistic, Anne decided she would use colors ranging from canary yellow to crimson red to rate her targets. If you're having trouble finding an intermediate target, start with one of the beginner targets, such as feeling bad, having a bad moment, losing it, or falling into a hole. These are generic targets that cover most holes people fall into. If you track these, you'll be able to identify feelings, thoughts, and behaviors associated with them which will help you to rename the target and make it more specific to you. To figure out intermediate targets, starting from beginner ones, follow the intermediate holes diary card target algorithm. On the PowerPoint presentation that you will find on the website, there is a review and practice component that covers the tools, techniques, and strategies that we have previously covered in the Simple course. Looking over these slides will help to consolidate the material. Let's look at the homework for this week. Thank you for spending this time with me, and see you next session.